Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is Scott Bennett and Michael J. on Shell Games. We're starting out a University of New California lecture series, and we're honored to have Chris Street with us, who is part of the New California movement. He has his own background and interesting experience in the professional world and the political world and other things. I'll let him introduce himself on that. His initial lecture on the China-United States economic history and unfolding plan was quite stellar. We're going to touch upon that, as well as some of his insights into the intelligence, defense areas that we see unfolding with regards to everything: China, Russia, Iran, and also perhaps some of the Kavanagh hearings and the implosion of the Democrat Party before the elections. What all of this means, specifically what it means to Californians and the University of New California and the New California State.com movement, which is gaining momentum. We're going to be having a constitutional convention this weekend in Southern California, and I would encourage people to go to newcaliforniastate.com for information on that. But we're honored to have you, Chris, and please go ahead and introduce yourself and your background and what you wanted to be addressing today. Go ahead, Chris Street.
What I'd like to do is give you a sense from a national security standpoint of where the United States is, what the future looks like, and how we got here. Now, most people would say how we got here, what the future would look like. But I think you have to define your situation first and then see where the road ahead is, and then talk about what happened over the recent decade that has created a path that no matter really who's in charge, we're going down that road. Now, my biggest issue is something called comparable advantage. There's a whole thing in economics called comparative advantage, in that for some reason, you make steel and you have all the expertise around you when you make steel, and pretty soon you have a center of excellence in steel. So there's no reason that I would make steel. Maybe I make aluminum. So I trade aluminum to you for steel as a nation. And we do business. We have comparative advantage. For some reason, maybe you have more coal and iron ore. I have more bauxite, and that defines how we get there in trade. Most people fail to understand the trade is a relatively new concept. But other than, say, the 1780s to 1800, the only trade that really took place internationally was something called the Silk Road. And the Silk Road had been around for about 1,500 years. And it was the only real reason that the East and the West traded, because the East had things the West wanted, and the West had things the East wanted. The East wanted gold, and the West wanted porcelain, and they wanted silk and other kinds of issues. It was sort of an elitist trade. And remember that the whole idea of, sailing to find, China accidentally ran into the United States and the Caribbean. So when you look at where we are historically, this is kind of a new game. I mean, it's only, less than 300 years since we started playing the game. And the game has moved quickly through sort of step-by-step structures that bring us to where we are today. And inexorably, no matter what we do, we're going that next step. So I don't know, Scott, how you want me to go forward on this. Do you want to ask me questions, or do you want me to give my sort of overall definition of where we are? Because where we are, Scott, is a environment where are we on, Scott?
Stand by. Okay, there we go. I was trying to bring up your comparative advantage slideshow to lecturing, if that's appropriate. I think it was that people can read again and again and again. So have that as the back share, and go according to that, and deviate as you see fit.
Right. Okay, so well, let's just talk about where we are. The only
let's set the tone right now. What we see in current geopolitics with you, and I would just posit, what does the average American see? What does the average person see? What they're seeing on the mainstream media, what they're seeing in Fox, what they're hearing and reading, with the average attention span is very limited, of course. But they're seeing hostility, they're seeing conflict, they're seeing a Navy destroyer of the Chinese shadowing a U.S. destroyer. We're seeing China being labeled as the great threat to American foreign policy. We're seeing China's geopolitical, geographic expansion into the South China Sea and the Spratly Islands. We have a rhetoric of China looks and plans in 100-year increments, where the United States looks in 5-year increments. So we're seeing a potential Trump hostility to China that is sort of mitigated with the success of the North Korea-South Korea alliance that seems to be healing very well. I think Trump is fallen into an opportunity to gain a lot of advantage and notoriety, which may save his presidency. I mean, his domestic policy presidency, of course, too, is, I think, hitting a very positive tone with the Americans. So there are international foreign policy debacles with regards to Iran and Russia that don't do him any good. Nothing that is currently being done towards Russia is going to help him, or because the American people don't have that antagonism or hostility towards Russia. So he's working against himself every time he does ugly things to Russia. No American has a problem with Russia. And at the same time, they really don't want a problem with Iran. And it seems Israel is pushing a lot of these problems in Syria. So Trump is in a dangerous place there, but China is just emerging. And that's kind of where I think the average American is looking on the international scope. Domestically, I think everyone loves him for NAFTA revocation. They love the idea of bringing back American jobs. They love the idea of reinvesting in American culture. And Leave It to Beaver, going back to the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, when American, at least the image and the notion of American manufacturing and American jobs might be, resurrected to a certain degree. Everyone loves that, but is that actually what we're seeing? Is that what's going to happen? And I like your economic forecasts and your economic variables that. This drives political decisions. Economics drives political decisions. But unfortunately, wars and moral outrage and propaganda also drives political decisions that drive economics. So I think there's a yin and yang component. There's the economic modalities and the economic resources of what the Americas have, as well as intellectual property besides resources, and what China has, what China doesn't have. It doesn't have, and maybe you can touch upon this too, it doesn't have the cerebral creativity that is part of the DNA of Americana, I would say. And I think that's where China's going to fall and break a little bit, because it doesn't have that spontaneity and entrepreneurship. It replicates it, it steals it and replicates it and such. But I'll just put that as the foundation intro and let you correct me. Go ahead.
Well, Scott, we're in a post-war world here. There was a war that nobody's been talking about, and really that war was the United States was in terminal decline. Its competitors took advantage of it. Whether that competitor was China, whether that competitor was Europe, America was in terminal decline because its comparable advantage being cheap energy costs that destroyed the British Empire, that defeated Japan, that defeated Germany, somehow, almost in a period of 4 years, disappeared. And that was really between 1972 and 1976. You saw all this turmoil, the impeachment of Nixon and all that. The underlying issue was that the American people figured out they were just starting to lose. It was obvious to the American people, it was obvious to the world that the United States was getting knocked off its pillar. The Japanese sort of thought they were on the way, but the United States getting knocked off their pillar destroyed the other balance in the world, which was the communist bloc. Now, whether you hate communists, like communists, whatever you are, it was extraordinary that military powers with such weapons were actually pretty responsible from 1950 till 1994 in the collapse of the Soviet Union without actually using them. Because the history of having tools, having weapons, and not using them is almost unheard of. The people who have weapons tend to use them. There was sort of a balance that worked for both parties. And when the communist bloc collapsed, it was a shock to most economists in the United States because the textbooks were still writing about how centralized government, a pre-planned economy, would prevail over the long term. You know, the textbook you took and you were reading in college in the 70s, and of course you were a leader in the 80s and the 90s. That textbook by Samuelson said that a centralized planned 5-year structure would dominate economics over time, and it was just a matter of when capitalism would decline. And having said that, out of nowhere, the Soviet Union collapsed. It was followed by a period of excitement and enthusiasm in Europe, and Europe saw the collapse of the Soviet Union not as the conquest by America of the world, the American empire. They saw it as the opportunity to displace the United States. Now, this is a little controversial, but when you look at economics, the European Union is actually larger in economics than the United States. It's 52 countries, and it structured itself in such a way as to be that next sort of era of a planned economic change. And that planned economic change brought institutions that were highly competitive against the United States, further depressing America's economic structure and putting Europe on a path to what most people thought would be economic dominance. That was played out over the next, say, 18 years until the great financial crisis of 2008, when the financialization of the United States economy, which was trying to make up for that which it had lost, its manufacturing competitiveness, essentially collapsed. And unlike the rest of the world, the United States, essentially 10 banker types got together in a small room, probably broke 50 laws, and restructured the US economy and sort of stabilized the crash. Now, having said this, if you were a European, you saw this as, you know, the end of the great American empire and the rise of the European empire. And Europe, over the next, say, 2 or 3 years, continued to do quite well. China continued to expand as a platform that was not only manufacturing for the United States, but its largest trading partner was actually the European Union. But you get to about 2012, something dramatic happens in Europe where all of a sudden the banking system in Europe has a crisis. And unlike the United States, where 10 people could get in a room to restructure the economy, there was no agreement between these 52 different countries in the European Union, who all got in the EU for prosperity. None of them got in the EU for responsibility. So you had a great divide where Southern Europe was told that they needed austerity, and Northern Europe was told that they didn't need to bail out Southern Europe. And over the next couple of years, at first unseen by Europe and clearly seen here in the United States had a energy revolution, not the kind of solar and wind that the people who do 5-year planning are all about. We had an energy revolution of fracking, and the United States, in a short period of time, more than doubled its production of oil from about 4.5 million barrels in 2009 to about 11 million barrels right now. And if we had the pipelines, it would probably be closer to 13 million barrels of oil. So the United States has had the greatest surge in comparable advantage over a short period of time of any nation on the history of the planet. Bigger than the United Kingdom with the rise of globalism in the 1880s, bigger than China could have ever imagined. It's actually the United States that ends up as the dominant player. And as the United States has entered the dominant player, these arrangements in Europe, which were about equals, Europe being equal or more equal than the United States, are collapsing, and the United States is going its own way. And going its own way is really different for the rest of the world, because implicit on the US dollar as the reserve currency was that a rich and financially progressive United States would provide a form of exchange that was accepted around the world, but B, as the lender of last resort, the United States would bail out anyone who got in trouble.
Now let me stop you. I think you hit a good point, a very important point that the average person is confused by, and Democrats and others are turning this into a negative. Trump going his own way, his sense of being isolated from other countries. You said it before, and I like to agree with that. That Trump is separating the United States from its reserve currency, ownership or control or managerial duty for greener pastures. There's greater hope, and your social or your entrepreneurial S-curve graph that I put up on the screen and I looked at I've seen that before, of course, in other models, and it's right on the money. And we find ourselves at I think on just about to take this curve with regards to Trump. He is seemingly isolating the United States, but in a positive way is the way to really present it. And maybe you can build on this to explain away to the Chicken Littles. Don't listen to the naysayers, the terrorists, the screaming banshee lunatics that are on stages on TV saying the world is going to come apart, America is going to fall apart because we're isolating ourselves, or we're no longer this great power, or whatever their rhetoric is. Explain the economics, that Trump's economic plan is going to yield a greater harvest of hope and prosperity in America, that his political choices are going to naturally have an effect of economic explosion that can't be contained. It's sort of like if you sow seeds in this fertile soil, it's eventually going to sprout up and yield a harvest. And can you explain what are the seeds that Trump is sowing? What are the actions that he's sowing now politically around the world that you see and are encouraged and enthusiastic are going to reap or cause this unseen future hidden blossoming harvest of economic enrichment, sort of like what Reagan did, I think, when he had his original tax cuts and his high level binder when he first got in office, that I think probably fueled a lot of the technological innovations and all of the success we had in the mid and the late 80s that really caused the bounty of the 90s that Bill Clinton cannibalized and took credit for. Can you draw some analysis of that? Go ahead.
Well, it's comparable advantage. The difference in, say, the 1990s is that the United States sort of found itself all of a sudden as the last guy standing. The Europeans saw this as the great advantage, and they swooped in with institutions. They started the euro. They did a lot of changes that put them in a competitive position to essentially replace the United States as the reserve currency of the world. This was a predatory action by the EU. It was talked about as somehow that they were, going to join the globalized economy, but the Europeans didn't see it as globalized economy. The Europeans saw it as the EU, and that they were taking the natural step to displace, these Americans who just got lucky and somehow got here. And in the process, they were right. The United States was on a terminal decline, headed for a currency crisis, headed for a monetary crisis that came about in 2006 to 2008. And that currency and monetary crisis would have broken the United States. But about 2002, a new technology, one of the hottest new technologies in the history of the planet, fracking, started revolutionizing America's structure. And by revolutionizing American structure, it gave the basis to convert the country back from financialization, which was the post-manufacturing, post-energy dominance alternative, the only real step that the United States had to take after the 1970s, to really reversing the process. And we're almost like back to the 1910, when the United States is starting to dominate in every way structure the rest of the world. The economic engine of the United States by 1910 really had broken the UK and was in the process of breaking Germany. But we look at the world now, there's no value to do financialization. There's no great value as a nation to absorb large amounts of deficits in order to justify expansion of trade worldwide. The United States has, the $20 trillion of debt that the United States has, about 2/3 of that, in my opinion, is really sort of trying to buy peace with the American middle class that has lost this manufacturing platform and had to get used to minimum wage or modest wages rather than the old $26 an hour factory jobs plus overtime. So where Trump is right now is he is a fortunate person who has come along with the right philosophy for the right time. The United States is moving away from globalism. We are moving away from international commitments that require the 300-ship U.S. Navy to patrol the seas and make trade successful for people who really don't have the same goals and expectations as we do, in the form of China and in Europe. It is Europe and China that are the losers of the new game. Trump is just simply the fellow who's handling the transition from the American economy. Trade in the U.S. never got more than 13% of GDP. But if you look in countries like Germany, it's 50+%. You look even at China with 1.3 billion, it's about 38% of their GDP. The United States can easily lose 5% of trade, or 5 points of trade, really trade getting cut in half, and do just fine, because the United States is now selling something that is essentially gold. The United States is selling oil and selling natural gas. At first, they're selling it to displace imports. But rapidly, the United States is becoming the largest exporter of energy on the planet. And as the United States becomes the largest exporter of energy on the planet, there is no reason that we should finance foreign nations' purchases of energy, we should trade them for hard currency. And that hard currency is something exchangeable to gold or near gold. So my belief is, Scott, that that conservatives don't understand that the U.S. monetary policy is moving back to gold, is moving back to hard exchange, because when you're selling gold, you're not going to sell it to someone else and finance their devaluing currencies. So my belief is that Trump, when you hear him talk about backing out of globalism, he's backing out of the costs of globalism. America is probably going to have a higher export and value of exports because the United States is going back to exporting energy. But there's really no reason that we need to have a logistics chain that manufactures product in China and breaks wages in the United States. That game is over. So when I look at this situation where, we're not participating with NATO and Trump is seeing going it alone, I cheer American century. The economics for the United States are absolutely exploding. The recent NAFTA renegotiations is worth over $100 billion to the United States on a continuous basis. So to put that in sort of discounted present value when you figure out what an annuity stream is worth, Trump probably just with paper, got about $1.7 trillion of value by going to the Mexicans and going to the Canadians and saying, my way or the highway. And if you're a Mexican and you're a Canadian and you look at this country that is on the move, whose economy is expanding, whose wealth is expanding, you had no choice, no alternative but to surrender. And that's really what happened. You take a look at North Korea. North Korea is the equivalent of an aircraft carrier for China sitting off of Japan. China's historic enemy, of course, is Japan. Japan, Vietnam, these are sort of the competitive nations that China has faced historically, and North Korea served its purpose well as an aircraft carrier for China to cow Japan, and in another way to cow the United States. But if you're North Korea, you're realizing that your big daddy, China, is on economic decline, and you have a choice. You can either go down with China or you can go up with the United States. So my belief is that North Korea understands they have the cheapest labor in the world. They are the natural next boom, since they're right next to South Korea. And oh, by the way, our good friends in China aren't willing to subsidize us or can't subsidize us going forward. So what I see, Scott, is that the United States has entered its new century, that we are actually going to have the equivalent of the Roaring Twenties economically, because this transition from loser to winner is so abrupt and so fracturing to the world that all of these sort of, this chaos you see on the outside doesn't actually have to do with America's chaos. Economically, America is winning. If you look at the Democrat Party, they changed teams somewhere in the Clinton administration to embrace globalism. They came to believe that, we don't really represent union workers and we don't really represent factory blue collar folks because we're really not going to have those people. When Obama campaigned for Hillary Clinton in 2016 in Elkhart, Indiana, there was a big gym, one of the few big, rallies they had, and he stood up there and said, these jobs are never coming back. And if you looked at the eyes of the people in that gym, they weren't interested in voting for somebody saying these jobs are never coming back, these manufacturing jobs. They were voting for prosperity, not for, somehow being comforted by, the president that it's going to be okay because we will soften the blow to your continually reducing lifestyle. Taking a look at where we are right now, Trump is doing everything possible to sort of like the magician that waves his hand on the left side, makes a lot of noise, or puts the money in his pocket. The turmoil that Trump is delivering to the left is keeping them very occupied and allowing him to get his economic program, his political program, and what is also seen as his economic program moving forward. The left is so terrorized by the words that Trump says, it's sort of as if they switched teams. In the 90s, the 2000s, and through Obama, it was the left that would terrorize conservatives. Now it's going the other way. When you take a look at the Kavanagh hearings, they are so preposterous to most Americans that the Democrat Party is not seen as someone standing up for the little guy. The Democrat Party is seen as somebody standing up for the deep state and itself. I think this is very destructive for Democrats. But given that the Democrats really don't have an economic philosophy, historically they've been the largest party in the United States, and they usually put their finger up and figure out which way the wind's blowing and tend to go that way. But for right now, the Democrat Party hasn't, they can't feel the wind in their sails yet. But I believe over the next, say, 5 years, the Democrats will re-embrace the idea of, supporting average Americans and average workers. So this is just a transition, and all transition, there's lots and lots of turmoil. And it shouldn't be surprising that you see these kind of absolutely explosions taking place, on the media. The media is probably worse than the Democrats in that they surround themselves with people that only think the way that they do. At least Democrats have to, go back to their districts and run for office. If you're the media, you pretty much are in the media nodes, and you just don't get out very much. Maybe you might do a Skype call, maybe you might, send some stringer out there, but New York doesn't really want to change. There's nothing in this for New York and Hollywood that could possibly be good, because New York and Hollywood are the key towns that were the winner in globalization. You take Silicon Valley, Hollywood, Washington, D.C., and New York, and these are the big, big winners. It doesn't mean that the United States was the big, big winner. It was that a few elitist towns, communities, were the big, big winner. And they clearly see that their power is not trickling away, it is flowing away. Road forward. Where are we at right now? How are we getting there? You're moving into a midterm election, and whatever happens in that election, it's very doubtful that the Democrats could possibly win back the Senate. It's possible that if what are called red state Democrat senators, vote against Kavanagh, the Republicans will have a tremendous hammer to take against the left in this election, to the Democrats. And my perspective is that people tend to vote their pocketbook. You may hear all this turmoil right now about Kavanagh, but the issues that people are listening to are there's a NAFTA deal, and that means, more jobs for Americans, better wages for Americans. You're seeing Amazon pretend that there's some kind of, morally driven to give $15 wage, when the bottom line is they can't get workers unless they pay $15. So these are economic drivers that the average person understands. They can see, we're hiring signs when they go to the market. It's a different world.
Because we see coming up the New California conference, we've got about 20 minutes before you have to go, I know. So I wanted to include the New California movement, the New California role in the economy that's unfolding. The problem, the main problem, the thorn in the side that I see, and again, I come from it from a psychological warfare perspective. I look at what are the thoughts and the words and the images and the feelings that are going through the human being that manifest in their base. So the Democrats understand that well. George Soros understands that well. That's why they influence Flake. They had a couple Soros operatives target Flake and berate and scream and ram crucifixes almost where the sun doesn't shine to sort of traumatize and terrorize Jeff Flake into this behavior. And that's the pattern of tyranny and abuse and maniacy that the Democrat leftists are falling into. Now, we all know they're rabid dogs that belong in a cage and also maybe to be put down because of this savagery that we saw when Trump was elected, that's not been abated in any way, but has been accelerated and become mainstream on the mainstream media. All of the media and The View and all of these programs have lost their minds, and the American public are divorcing themselves from the mainstream media sources of information because of it. And Kavanagh is the canary in the coal mine, if you will. And besides everything being a complete lie and this Blasey Ford and everything unraveling, and it's increasingly seeming like an internal FBI or former FBI employee operation. Her friend was FBI and counseled her, and all of this stuff is coming about. But on the larger psychographic level, the larger behavioral pattern of the masses in America, we need to forecast where are their behaviors going to be inclined? What are they going to be doing? That's what work is. That's what economic prosperity and productivity is. It's work. It's putting your hands to the plow or the computer or the pen or the microphone or whatever you're doing to generate economic stimulation that generates the material that people feed and live upon. So where are we going as a society internally in America and specifically in New California? Because it seems like if the economic models that you're forecasting are going to be happening, you're going to see Korea become our best friends, our new best friends. And I would say Russia is also our best friend in the wing, and maybe they're already our best friend, but with a wink and a nod, Trump's not letting everybody know that. And I would say Iran eventually can be brought to the table, but focusing on Iran or on North Korea and Russia and the suppression of China, and at the same time creating a new economic engine in America. How do you see California benefiting and profiting from this? Because we're constricted by the left-wing governor, a left-wing communist mono-party system that we've been constantly addressing in the grievances in New California. We see a lot of arterial blockages in the political body in California that we're trying to amputate and creating a new California. How do you see the new California and the new economy and a new society in the laws of a new California? How do you see all that coming together? Go ahead.
Well, I see the destruction of Silicon Valley's economic engine, and these things are cyclical. But how many people have come on your show and talked about Facebook's traffic fell from 8.5 billion visitors a month to 4.7 billion visitors a month in just 2 years in the month of July? We're talking a 50% reduction in the traffic in social media. This should be, this is a not just a trumpet. This is a klaxon horn to the fact that something is changing in the economics of Silicon Valley. Remember that what was driving the Democrats, what has been driving their whole game, has been this use of specialized media in the form of social networking that gave them access to a greater and greater platform, allowed them to communicate. Part of that greater ability to communication was the centralization of the internet between, say, 2010 till 2018, to where two main players, Google and Facebook, pretty much had cornered the market for advertising and had the ability to have all of the information on every American. Somehow, it looks like young people are figuring out that, that party you went to, if you put it on Facebook, it might come back to haunt you, say 25 years later, if your name is Kavanagh or something like that. Could you imagine what these hearings would be like if they took kids' Facebooks? There's something called the Wayback Machine, which, records everything that's ever been on Facebook. But, Kavanaugh is the last guy who will ever go through a confirmation hearing that isn't involved with a social media history. All these young people have figured out that everybody is watching them, everybody is selling them out, and they are leaving these platforms. There's a new internet coming. As a matter of fact, it was just announced last week. But what it really is use of a blockchain, sort of like cryptocurrencies. It's called the block stack. And what it does is it breaks up communications between parties, say between you and I, and puts pieces on different servers in different areas where they can only be reassembled from your control. So the idea that Google and Facebook are capturing everything you do and then selling it is really an economic engine that is about to go dead in the water. So I see the change for the Democrats, that this is their greatest hurrah. Right now, you have the greatest spending on online advertising in history. It has destroyed the newspapers, which of course was the left, and it is about to destroy itself. So I'm not really fearful of these changes. If I'm a conservative, I applaud them. Just like any technological innovation, you start off with a few people, very creative, they make fantastic decisions, they get great rewards from it. This is really what Barack Obama did as a appointed senator that in his first 100 days announced that he was going to run for president and amazingly won. He was the first to embrace social networking and social media. That was eclipsed by Donald Trump, who overlaid a business strategy structure onto social media and micro-targeted not only the people that support him, but micro-targeted the people that oppose them to send messages to them to make them even angrier, to make them do really stupid things and go crazy. Now, you are here in America at this point of change. This is going to be an American change. The new internet is going to be an American internet that is going to really change the rules for the rest of the world. China wants to have its own internet, wants to have a centralization by the Chinese government. Competitively, that's going to hurt China. So I see, Scott, America winning in every aspect, and I see the left in this incredible grieving stage. I think that as a conservative, you should understand that this acting out is sort of like, it's sort of like a teenager who somehow has lost all of his clout. Somehow he's a social outcast, and he can't understand why, and he's angry, and the only thing he can do is act out. So I see the left's incredible effort to get back on track as an example of how they failed. The strategies they're using right now, attacking people, shaming people and such, historically, that has never been a good strategy to win elections. Elections are won on economic issues. There's always, some social issues and values, but it's economics that drives it.
Yeah.
So Scott, I'm very positive. Now for New California.
Yeah, and I share a lot of your analysis. I think the left is an implosion, and as a unapologetic conservative, I celebrate that, of course, because everything the left represents is anti-individual, anti-family, anti-God, anti-creativity. Really, it's anti-man at its heart, and we see that in the religion of political correctness. We see that in people like Senator Mazie Hirono and their suppressed, violent feminist fascism, in stating that all men should sit down and shut up. And I've addressed that in a speech I gave about how, as a military officer and all military people, we've sacrificed and served so that no one sits down and shuts up in this country. But it's showing their true colors. And as much as they're imploding, I'm always very cautious and suspicious and skeptical. Like the old special forces guy said, I get paid to be suspicious when I got nothing to be suspicious about. I'm suspicious about John Bolton. I'm suspicious about Nikki Haley. I'm suspicious about Mike Pompeo. And of course, I know I'm not more than suspicious. I'm actually condemnatory towards Dianne Feinstein because I know how she suppressed and hid terrorist financing information with Senator Bill Nelson in a letter that Bill Nelson wrote to her about me. But that'll all come out and she'll be prosecuted for it. But my concern is Trump and not letting him, because he's ignorant of the military. He doesn't perhaps know that he's surrounded by bureaucrats in uniform that aren't really John Wayne courageous warriors. As much as we'd like to think they are, they're bureaucrats, and half of the people above the rank of colonel, when you go beyond colonel, you're nothing but a bureaucrat, and you have no real manhood and sense of courage. You're in it for your own career and your own prosperity. But Trump is surrounded by these people that I worry are going to derail him, or maybe plotting against him, or maybe doing things out of, again, this neoconservative madness that started the wars since 2001 and really have done not a single good that I can see or measure for America or Americans, and especially in the kids that have become decapitated, killed, dismembered, burned alive, ruined for the rest of their lives, the families. The 18 years of war has had a crippling social cost to the American psyche. And I am suspicious that people who really don't care about that are continuing to push Trump into the next phase of that. And maybe you can address some of those concerns. Go ahead.
Well, under globalism, America had to be the great Navy and go places. This idea that you needed a 300-ship Navy, you needed to use it. When you're the financial guarantor of the world, it's sort of like the banker that needs to go and collect the debt. These were sort of glorified debt collectors, and that's what they were used for. The washing of the petrodollar trade was, sort of like, a bank collector going out there and breaking heads to make sure that we got what we wanted. That game is over, Scott. And why I believe that game is over is there's no upside in playing that game. When you're an exporter of oil, you can't wash dollars. You're not buying enough oil. It's China that's buying oil. It's Europe that's buying oil. They need to wash those transactions. It's a different world. Now, when you look at real estate prices in Manhattan and Silicon Valley, they are collapsing. Rent is down 20% plus in both Manhattan and Silicon Valley. Now, 20% doesn't sound a lot unless you've actually had a loan in real estate. 20% is all of your equity if you put 20% down to buy a house, right? So if you bought a house in Silicon Valley or a flat in Manhattan, you have lost most of your net worth because these things cost $1 million. We're talking real money disaster here, and that assumes everybody doesn't decide to try to sell. Now, where we're going with this issue of the military is a transitional state. My belief is that Trump has made a lot of noise about Syria and done very little. He may have given a little money here because the NATO people wanted it. He may have given a lot of, those missiles that he fired at an air base in Syria conveniently never hit the revettes where they actually had jets. It hit areas on the taxiway. It conveniently hit places where there weren't planes. It didn't do real damage. It didn't wipe out 70% of the air capability at an Air Force base. America is definitely arming some people, and you don't see the same kind of game going on as you saw before. The United States may be in Afghanistan, but we're not aggressively in Afghanistan. I think that there will always be a discussion about Israel, but you don't see the United States doing something to stop Russia from delivering S-300 anti-missiles to the Syrian government. That is a change vehicle that probably it negates the F-16 and the F-18. It probably negates, the F-35, which America could never allow losing one because all that technology would go to the rest of the world. So, Trump may look like he's, yelling and screaming and raising his hand, but if you watch what he's actually doing, he's taking very small steps. If you're Netanyahu, a guy who said that if America invades Iraq, it'll bring peace to the Middle East for 2 decades, 2003, how's that been working?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the probability that Trump is looking now to do a deal with the Palestinians, this may be a radical concept. A lot of people are going to get upset I say this, but I think Trump is looking to empower the Palestinians for a global settlement in the Middle East. There is no money deal. There is no financial upside to Saudi Arabia from raising hell when they are really the country that's on the bubble. Trump said today to the Saudis, without us, you're done. I think we're going to get a deal. I think Trump is moving to make it difficult for the Israelis to not come to a settlement.
I think Trump, again, in a businessman's way, he's able to make he parses his deal. So in his mind, he's got deal A, deal B, deal C. And A is its own deal. When he makes that, it's done. Putting A away, we're all happy. We're all celebrate. We clash the champagne glasses, and that's away. Now we have deal B, and Trump starts from scratch. Hey, we don't like you here. We don't like you there. We need this. And most of the world says, well, wait a minute. We got along with deal A. And Trump says, that's done. I'm not talking about that ever again. I want deal B. So he's got this ability to compartmentalize his deals, which we all understand in business, and he knows it better than anyone. And that's where the shock and awe comes, because he's made a deal with Saudi Arabia and Israel and such before. That was deal A. Now he's on deal B, and deal C is going to be even more dramatic because he's incrementally moving us in the direction that you're talking about. And I agree with you. And that's where the excitement comes, because deal C is going to come in the next couple years, and probably after his 2020 reelection. And that's where you're going to have the Reaganite renaissance in America. But, there is a degree of faith and hope and trust that comes with that in his advancement. The thing that I'm always suspicious about are the people around him, because, again, there is a social psychological cost to all of this negative hostility and rhetoric that other people start airing and mouthing on the airwaves. I think Nikki Haley is a disaster for our foreign policy public relations image, and I think Pompeo is to a degree, and Bolton, my God, I mean, Senator Black has said, I can't imagine a worse person to put in there than John Bolton. So this is what other people in the know are kind of saying about the people around him. And again, that's our concern, is that these people around him don't wear him down, or don't get him stuck, or don't move him in a direction that's going to hurt him. But we'll have to pick that up at another time because I know you've got other things you have to do now. Thank you for being with us. We will have you on again to pick this up, Chris Street. And if you have any final comments so we can let you go, please go ahead.
Well, Scott, I believe Trump does not play small ball. I think the UN is small ball. You know, a lot of people talking and nobody doing. You know, that's all small ball. I think Trump understands the art of the deal. The art of the deal is you don't feel good about the little increments you negotiate. You feel good about the deal. And he wants a global deal. And each one of these issues he started, whether it was the election of 2016, whether it's his withdrawing of America from the Middle East, these are big deals, and he likes to complete the big deal. And I think he's pretty much on the way. So, you know, Scott, it's always great to be with you because this is an opportunity where, you know, people actually get to have opinions and say
them. Chris Street, thank you for being with us. This is Scott Bennett and Michael J. We are inaugurating our University of New California lectures, and Chris Street is one of our brilliant economic geopolitical analysts. We will have him on again. Thank you for being with us.